With your host, Adrian Younge.
So for blacks, art is, it's not really a frivolity. It's not fake or frivolous. It's always an examination of the fundamental social and economic pressures of our time. And my next guest is special and has spent decades deploying a purely genuine optic into the psyche of Black America.
Let's see. When you say decades, it makes you already make me sound like I'm old or some shit.
Hey, hold on, let me finish.
Like the last 5 years, man.
Hey, I gotta finish with my grand entrance. So, as a journalist, he served as a tenured writer for some of the most important Black culture periodicals, ranging from The Source to Vibe magazine. He's produced and written on television shows ranging from Southland, Luke Cage, Ray Donovan to films like the Biggie biopic Notorious to Straight Outta Compton, Creed 2, I can go on and on. But moreover, this is one of the best people I've ever met, and I'm lucky to call him not just a friend, but he's like a family member. Please welcome my brother, Mr. Cheo Coker.
Adrian, man, thank you for that incredible intro, and I also have to second that. Over the course of working together, it started off as a friendship from day one, but it's family.
Yes.
You and Ali and Drew are family. My kids, always talk about DC and hanging out with Uncle Drew, and just being in the studio. It's funny. It's like we had some incredible sessions at the studio. But the only thing that my kids remember is playing NBA Jam in the lobby.
That's funny, man.
You know what I'm saying? It's
dude.
That's the thing that's really always interesting about history is that we knew when we were working on Luke Cage that we were making history, but my kids just remember just the little things. You know what I'm saying? They might remember showing up and watching, what's the brother's name? Kingfish.
Yeah.
Play those incredible guitar solos.
Yes, man.
But we have memories of just that was the one thing I don't think people really appreciate is that you guys, 26 episodes of Luke Cage, you guys produced 26 albums worth of material. When I say it like that, because when you listen to Luke Cage, there's nothing lazy. There's nothing rote. It's every last episode from a musical standpoint was bespoke. And so that was one of the things that bonded us was that I knew that when I was up, at 4:00 in the morning about to do a polish because, Mike Coulter or Simone Missick or Theo Rossi or Mahershala Ali or Alfre Woodard or Rosario Dawson was about to shoot a scene. I also knew that I could call you or I could call, Ali and you guys were working on something and we just constantly traded stuff.
Well, something that's very interesting to me, and this kind of segues into the larger discussion I wanted to have, is that, we are Black people that have taken on a duty to ensure that we do as much as we can to uplift and edify what we believe in, and I will get back to this. I want to just go backwards for a second to come here. And I want to start off by saying, in the South, the resurrection of white supremacy in the late 19th century vitiated an entirety of protections and political resources in place for Black Americans during the Reconstruction period.
Mm-hmm.
A time when we were granted, and I say in quotations, freedom following the Civil War. The KKK and other terrorist organizations like the Knights of the White Camellia were founded as retribution against the Blacks that, in quotation marks, caused the Civil War.
Sound real familiar.
Now, Do we still feel the wrath of Jim Crow in the 21st century?
Absolutely. Absolutely, we do. Because whether it was the use of the color red by a lot of the, everything from the rebel flag to a lot of the early groups. There was a group, I can't remember the name of the group that preceded the Ku Klux Klan, but they were also known for bright colors, including the color red, and how they terrorized the newly freed slaves that were finally, actually, you can't say finally acknowledged as Americans, because we're still not acknowledged as Americans.
Right.
Even to this day, as our vote and as our opinions are widely disenfranchised and
Absolutely.
legitimized. So the thing is that have things gotten better? Yes, but at the same time, no. Things are better from the standpoint that we do have a voice and that we realize the power of our voice and the power of our vote. No, from the standpoint that we constantly still have to, on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis, reestablish the fact that we are human and we are Americans, and that this is our country, and that we worked and labored, and that we are the constant defenders of a democracy that it seems to me that these other forces don't really believe in. Whether it was the mobilization of the Black vote, and how you constantly see it on Twitter, like how Black women saved democracy twice. And then at the same time, when you get to that moment, I cannot believe a week ago there was an actual armed insurrection that was televised. I mean, and this wasn't the Gil Scott Heron revolution would be televised. It was a different revolution. It was an insurrection. But I don't know what you want to call that, hillbilly hoedown, whatever that was. But there was this moment where you saw this horde of people coming after this one Black security guard. And it looked like he was retreating. It looked like he was holding off the horde basically with a flashlight and a gesture. And it looked like he was running. It turns out what he was doing was he was leading that charge away from an unprotected, open Senate floor. And the reason he was on his radio was because they were telling him, okay, now the doors are secure. And he realized there's a moment where we see on the video where he turns his head and he turns back and he keeps trying to bring them up. He was basically baiting this crowd with their own racism to follow me, the unarmed Black security guard, up these stairs, because he was leading them past the unprotected Senate floor where they wanted blood and they wanted to take people hostage. And so yet again, I mean, thank God he didn't die, because it would have been another Crispus Attucks moment. But yet again, American democracy was protected by one Black man. You can't make it up.
That's crazy. And when you refer to Crispus Attucks, obviously you're talking about the American Revolution. You're talking about a time when Blacks were promised freedom if they fought on the side of the Americans against the British. You're also talking about a time when the British said, yo, we'll promise y'all freedom if you fight on our side. You're also talking about a time when the Americans did not want to allow, or actually refused to allow, Blacks to fight for America, and only said okay after they saw so many Blacks seditiously going to the other side to fight for their freedom. You see? So it's interesting how when we are living in America, we are living in the vestige of racism, a brazen racism that now only comes out in a way that's not as clairvoyant as it once was. And it's interesting that you, as a journalist, you've taken on the duty. Actually, let me rephrase, not as a journalist, as an artist, because you're doing way more than just write. You do so much, but you've taken on this duty to deploy an optic that recognizes injustice. And, you know,
You know what that is, honestly? It
hmm,
it comes from when you talk about how the norms and the rules that were put on African Americans. You initially, when you were talking about it, you're talking about it from the standpoint of the black codes, of the rules of Jim Crow, of how we were hemmed in and what we could and what we couldn't do.
hmm,
And we learned to subvert these, shackles, so to speak, and free ourselves with our expressions, with our language, with our rhythm, with our music, with our moments. Um, you can even go back to the analogy of how, you know, the difference between the black music of the Caribbean, meaning Jamaica and Cuba. The reason it's always sounded different than, Southern African American music, despite the fact that all of the slaves from all those areas came from the same West African countries, is that in Jamaica and in Cuba and throughout, and Portugal and in Brazil, those slaves got to keep their drums. In America, there were
mm,
too many slave uprisings. So
right.
they took away the drum and thought that they could quell those uprisings, with guitars, with fiddles. But what happened is that much the same way that how, 200 years later with, with drum machines and samplers, they, um, producers would figure out ways to flip things and find counter and double and triple rhythms inside of something. They did the same thing with replicating African rhythms with guitars, with these other instruments. And even as they learned classical, European, musical structure, the blues and all these other art forms were that way of subverting and making that structure and those rules into something that was black, unique, and their own. And all I've ever endeavored to do as a television writer, as a screenwriter, is, I write about black themes and African American culture because I love it, not because it's the only thing that I can write about. But in doing that, I always try to, whether people reading my screenplays or people, watching the movies and television shows that come, knock on wood, when they get made, I always try to put more in there because it's a way of subverting expectations, but at the same time, in the words of James Brown, you got to use what you got to get just what you want. Because all we really want is the ability to express unadulterated blackness in a way that it can be appreciated by anybody. And I
So,
think that that's all I really endeavor to do, to be perfectly honest.
no, that's interesting. Let's go back. Can you tell me how and why it was so important to you to report on this new diaspora, this hip hop? Why was it so important to you to do it?
For me, it was a couple of things. I held on to hip hop more tightly than a lot of my peers because of where I grew up. I grew up in Storrs, Connecticut, which is where the University of Connecticut, of course, is based. And now, of course, UConn being a basketball powerhouse, people have heard of Storrs. But when I was growing up, I mean, it was the place where cow tipping was invented. It was about as far away from African American culture as you can get. And so when my cousins, Timby and Nandi, who are the daughters of, Valerie Wesley, the author who's my mother's older sister, and Richard Wesley, the screenwriter who wrote Uptown Saturday Night and Let's Do It Again, when they would come up to visit, they're my first cousins. When they would come up from New Jersey to visit, they would, tape Red Alert. They would tape Mr. Magic. And for me, my uncle's hip hop collection, and at the same time, those tapes were my cultural lifeline. Because you have to understand, these are the olden days of no internet. This is the olden days where you had to drive 40 miles to even get close to being able to hear a New York radio station. You had to drive 50 miles to even be able to buy a hip hop record. So anytime that they would come to visit and they would be like, oh, I'm sick and tired of this Red Alert tape. This is played out. You know, you can have this. I would just hold on to that. And so that was just like my lifeline, you know, because I'm still corny, but I was even cornier back then. But like that music was, I just wanted to hear what other Black men or kids my age, what they were talking about, what they were into, and that's what the music was. And so then by the mid '80s, I was a scholarship student to a prep school. I went to Hotchkiss, which is, you know, very, very fancy, very prestigious boarding school. But there were a lot of kids at Hotchkiss that were a part of this program called the Better Chance and Oliver Scholars and these other programs where they would basically recruit talented young students from, you know, Harlem and the Bronx and Brooklyn and other parts of New York, and give them the opportunities, tuition free, to go to diversify a place like Hotchkiss. And as I started meeting kids that were from New York, they also would explore, like the incredible cultural critic and writer Rob Marriott, who's one of my oldest friends. Rob and I met at Hotchkiss, strangely enough. You know, Rob, growing up in Brooklyn, was privy to all types of stuff. And so as I was trying to figure out my life and figure out the music, and I'm basically caught between worlds, because it's like the New York kids were like, yo, you talk funny. And you know, at the same time, you're constantly trying to balance like these different worlds. Like on one hand, my grandfather was a Tuskegee Airman. You know, he flew with the 100th Fighter Squadron and had money, but had 2 retirements, because he retired as a lieutenant colonel and also worked at UConn. So he came from a lot of money. My father was from Hamilton Street Projects. He was from the ghetto in New Haven. And I was constantly like, you know, how they describe that character in the movie The Departed, you know, like how Mark Wahlberg calls Leonardo DiCaprio, you know, this lace curtain motherfucker. Like, you know, he's one way, one place, another place, another place. I was caught between the 2 Connecticuts. The only way it made sense for me was, as I was at this point at 15 years old, where I was really trying to like figure out who it is I was. I read the autobiography of Malcolm X the same summer that I listened to It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. And all of a sudden, everything made sense. All of a sudden, I realized that there wasn't just one way to be Black. And then at the same time, I also was introduced to a whole different level of hip hop, and just in terms of the possibilities and how limitless, you know, the art form was. And, you know, I just started to take it more seriously. And then what happens is, like, as I'm listening to these records, I'm looking to read about the music. And in doing that, at the time, it was hard to find writing about hip hop. There was no centralized place. You would search in the Village Voice, and you know, that's when you would read you know, everyone from Nelson George, Greg Tate, you know, Harry Allen would pop up in the Voice. You know, at the same time at Spin Magazine, Bones Malone, John Leland, Frank Owen, you know, were writing about music. Occasionally there would be a New York Times piece, because even though, you know, Word Up Magazine and Right On were definitely, you know, publications that were pioneers just in terms of covering hip hop, the kind of coverage it basically was like a hip hop version of Tiger Beat, meaning that it was because pre-internet, pre-Instagram, it was a place where you could get a double fold picture of Run DMC and maybe find out that like DMC like licorice or some shit like that. But you weren't going to get any deep knowledge as to how they came together as a group, who they were, like that kind of thing. You know what I'm saying? So it wasn't really until my senior year of high school that actually right before I graduated, and before I started at Stanford, a friend of mine, his brother named Tony Arthur, who was from Brooklyn, I went to visit him over the summer, and I picked up my first issue of the Source magazine, and it was the Source cover. It was the first color cover of the Source magazine, which was a picture of, which was a Malcolm X cover. And I read the Source, and to me, reading my first issue of the Source, that issue, it was like that moment in Goodfellas when Henry Hill is like looking across the street at the cab stand, and he's like, "That's what I want to do. That's where I want to be." And that was solidified a year later when I was in New York and I went to SOBs and KRS-One was performing, and the Source Mind Squad had a table, and I mean KRS-One was and still is kind of like a god to me. If you have my two hip hop deities, it's KRS-One and Rakim, right? And because in a way they're kind of like the alpha and the omega when it comes to a certain type of hip hop. And so KRS-One leaves stage, and then he goes to talk to, like, I think it was either Reef or John Schechter or Chris Wilder or some of the guys that were part of the Source Mind Squad. And I'm across the room watching him like a head of state going to that table and dapping people up. And I'm like, oh my God, that's what I want to do. And then I just became obsessed, And so it's like, you felt writing about hip hop that you were on a mission. You were on a mission to protect the art form from all these different people that had no idea what it meant, that had no idea the importance of what was happening with these records. But, the people at the Source, the people at Rap Pages, they knew what was going on. And that's what you wanted to be a part of. You wanted to write for them. You would just try to figure out how to join that. Because, I mean, again, now it's so easy. Now on Twitter, you can find your people. On Instagram, you can find your people. It was much harder back then,
So it's interesting because you understand that the bleaching of a culture is dangerous.
Yeah.
And, we must all be cognizant of what pure artistry is and where it comes from, especially when it's coming from us, because for so long, for centuries, we had to deal with a perspective that was an erroneous perspective, an overdetermined stereotype created to eugenically define us as inferior. So, all coverage on what we do is important because this podcast is about our journey from pre-slavery to pre-equality. We're still not there. And when we use our voice to educate people about where we are, people come, they develop a better understanding. So it's interesting because I had a monologue regarding journalism. And I went on my on my Instagram page, and I said, to all my fellow artists that are of color, stop pandering to whitewashed critics that hold themselves as the gatekeepers in understanding our creative culture. It's a system that arbitrarily dilutes the importance of our art. All of us artists that have some sort of clout must take a stand because this is one of the reasons our art is never fully comprehended. And from a cultural standpoint, there are a myriad of reasons as to why the Black artist is plagued by cultural indifference. Black musical institutions need not to, they shouldn't sacrifice to commercially conform so that the Black artist could earn a living. Not now. And this is what we had to do, during the minstrel and blackface era, and trace of this malevolent enigma still haunt us to this day. And I talked about how in most major outlets, white critics are given the authority to arbitrarily write the reviews of our films, our music, and commensurate art. And if you study the etiology of race music, Black photography, film, you will notice a common denominator. Major outlets generating subjective and ill-informed critiques about the Black experience and its correlation to the arts. I know too many.
Well, no, that's the thing. It's like, when you look back at someone like Gordon Parks.
Yes.
Gordon Parks was such an important writer, photographer, in terms of just being the first person to like not only capture so many historical moments with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King
Absolutely, yeah.
and the music and the movement, but also just the conditions that people were living in Harlem and all these different places and in the rural South. But he had to fight tooth and nail to get Time Life to basically say, look, you want to cover Black people, but you don't have any Black people covering Black people. So you get better insight. Like, I mean, you have to understand. I mean, the LA Times, which was one of the places where I got my name, you know, as a writer. You know, the first brother to integrate the LA Times was I'm sorry that I don't know his name, but true story. The first Black writer at the LA Times got hired because of during the LA riots, the Watts riots.
Wow.
They didn't have anybody that they could safely send to Watts to find out what was going on. So this young brother who was basically a copy boy leveled up and went to Watts and that's how the first LA Times Black, you know, journalist was hired essentially. And even some of my favorite books about jazz, like, you know, Ross Russell's book about Charlie Parker, or you know, Bird Lives, I think is the name of that book, or, you know, a lot of the things that Leonard Feather would write, Nat Hentoff, they certainly absolutely, you know, are some of the dons and godfathers of critical thought in jazz. But at the same time, it was with Leroy Jones, aka Amiri Baraka, you know, reading blues people. That's what gave me an understanding about myself and about the importance of our music, and also understanding that it was our responsibility, you know, to cover and be a part of the coverage of history, of being capturing the history. You know, that was some of that was really the thing, because, you know, perfect example. It's like, yes, absolutely, Frank Owen and John Leland and Mike Sager and you know, the late Jonathan Gold, you know, wrote incredible pieces about hip hop, and they were really, I learned a lot from them. But at the same time, it was important that for young Black writers to also capture this musical cultural revolution that is known as hip hop, because hip hop was the first art form that, even as it was coming to fruition, it was the opportunity for Black ownership in terms of, you know, the labels, and now, you know, people knowing more about publishing and understanding and trying to, at the very least, have those conversations. They were having conversations that their R&B and jazz grandfathers never had. And then at the same time, you had magazines, and you had Black people, Black men and women, and photographers also alongside their white brothers and sisters, because we do in hip hop have a great cross, you know, collateral of Black, Latinx, and white and Asian people that are a part of this family and this melting pot, you know, because hip hop brought us together. And we're the same coalition, of course, that elected Barack Obama twice, because it was our friendships and our, you know, cultural meldings through the music that laid the groundwork to break through a lot of the racism that prevented, you know, things that happened in the early 2000s from happening. And what's crazy is, like, now in the midst of all this crazy Trump QAnon nonsense, we're going backwards. And so we're going to have to, just as important as it is to recognize Blackness and celebrate Blackness, we also, I think, have to be open towards not reconciliation. It's really respect. It's really respect and acknowledgement. Then at the same time, working with allies to bring this country together. You know, you know, and that's what it's going to take. And I think part of that is going to be with our art. Part of it's going to be with the music. And part of that is having white people understand, like, look, y'all have been at the forefront and the subject of all these different movies and films and everything else. We need to get our shit off. And then after doing that, we can find ways and bridges where we can now do this together. And I think that's really what's happening right now. and why so many white people, frankly, are hungry for Black stories, because they realize that they need to be a part of being part of the solution rather than the problem.
Well, some of my favorite journalists are white journalists, and as much like race doesn't really matter when it comes to whether you are able or inept. It's about creating some kind of equilibrium of thoughtful analysis so that the Black artist is no longer the victim of an arbitrary critique against a lot of these gatekeepers. And I say this all to say that right now, we as artists, as creators, are changing this perspective. And, in writing for film and television, with what you do, how does this concept of double consciousness, the psychological challenge of Blacks facing, always looking at themselves through the eyes of a racist society versus just looking at themselves in the mirror, like, how do you write understanding what we deal with every day?
I write and produce, and hopefully at some point will direct from the platform of inclusive Blackness. I always called Luke Cage, inclusively Black rather than exclusively Black, meaning that the show itself was going to be a deep dive into unadulterated Black culture, but it was done in such a way that even if you weren't Black, you could begin to understand something about us if you just had the patience and the time to just, hang out and figure it out. You know what I'm saying? Because perfect example, like one of my favorite movies is Danny Boyle's movie Train Spotting. I know nothing about heroin. I know nothing about Scotland. But, you watch that movie and all of a sudden, all those cultural norms fall away because the storytelling is so incredible.
Social commentary. It's social commentary, brother.
Like a lot of, as much tension as there's been between, African Americans and Italians, and particularly in New York City, both cultures love each other's culture, because like Goodfellas and Casino and Mean Streets and like Scorsese is as revered as Spike Lee, and and also both of them revere each other,
Yes.
And so that's the thing, is that like culture is the cheapest special effect. It's a way of being able. That's what made Luke Cage different. Was like I knew we weren't going to necessarily have the budgets, and that wasn't really a Marvel thing as much as it was just like that was across the board. It wasn't like any of that, without violating any Marvel secrets. It wasn't like any of that the shows got more money than we did. We had a limited amount that we could do, but I knew that like if you were spending that money on getting Rakim, if you spending that money on some of the things that we were able to pull off, Okay, really to answer your question about the double consciousness, I've made a career out of essentially translating Black culture for white people in a way that does not offend Black people, which is
interesting.
Which is a slippery slope, because I constantly have to be true to protecting our culture and showing our culture, good, bad, or indifferent, in a way that in the presentation has quality, but do it in a way that when people see it, they don't feel like they're being pandered to, or it's pandering.
How is this exemplified in the Biggie biopic, Notorious?
Well, Notorious was tough. It was tough from a standpoint in that two different filmmakers wanted to make two different movies, because initially Antoine Fuqua wanted to make Notorious, and I was caught in between because I wrote I knew Biggie and wrote the biography, Unbelievable: The Life, Death, and Afterlife of Notorious B.I.G. And Biggs, admittedly, was rough and tumble. I mean, he was flawed. I mean, he was gritty, but at the same time, he acknowledged it and was in his music. I mean, that's what I loved about talking to him as a journalist, was that he was completely unvarnished. He didn't give a fuck, but he was so smart. And he was funny. And the initial draft that I wrote, because I had never written a movie before. Well, actually, I had written movies before, but I'd never written a movie that got made before. Was I wasn't thinking about budget. I wasn't thinking about what you could do. I also wasn't thinking about the sensibilities of his mother and the managers producing the movie. So it was raw. And Antoine's movie, he basically wanted to make Somebody's Gotta Die as a movie. George Tillman, wanted to make Juicy. Meaning that he wanted a movie that was basically a classic Biggie song, but that was also pop. And that was kind of the studio mandate. George also wanted to kind of, do an unvarnished story. And when you watch Notorious now, there are a lot of elements that are kind of rough, It's not like such a feel-good movie that it doesn't get into the gritty elements of Biggie's life. But it was basically Notorious crawled so that Straight Outta Compton could fly. And so because of budget, because of a lot of things, and fighting with a studio that had never seen in a modern sense, a hip hop movie for real, like there were a lot of back and forth. And so it's like when Reggie Rock Bythewood came in and, rewrote the script that we both share credit on, and that's deservedly so, because Reggie Rock wrote, I would say the structure of the movie is probably 100% mine, but I say dialogue is probably 70% Reggie, 30% of me in terms of that film. But I learned a lot from what Reggie did, because Reggie was walking the tightrope that you're talking about, which is that he was trying to get a movie that could be made for the budget, a movie that, even though certain things were fictionalized, could still be regarded as authentic to the hip hop audience, but then at the same time, with a nervous studio, keep the nervous studio at bay. I learned a lot from what Reggie did. And it's lessons that have stayed with me to this day, in terms of just not being dispassionate about the writing, but understanding that as a screenwriter, you're a caterer, essentially. Meaning that whatever the person paying for the meal wants, you can try to give them as many, hey, try a little bit of this. You love this spice, you want that. But if they want what they want, you got to give them what they want. And so, but at the same time, you can try to figure certain things out. And just the way acting, a lot of stuff that I saw, and that I didn't really fully understand until I had the experience of becoming a television staff writer, eventually a television producer, and ultimately a showrunner. That's the thing.
But my thing is this, and I'll kind of close on this. Part of us getting to the point of equality is highlighting the fact that we always have to conform, right? Instead of just being ourselves.
Right.
And, we understand who hires us for a lot of these jobs. We understand what it is that we have to do, but at the same time, we, as a team, continue to push so that we could tell the true story, so that we can dispel the negative stereotypes that are purported towards our people. And as a brother, I want to thank you for everything that you're doing and have done. I can't wait for us to start working again on what's happening soon.
But before we wrap up,
yeah,
one of the things that taught me every lesson that we're talking about was when we worked together on Luke Cage. And it's funny if we really think about it.
One of the greatest experiences of my life.
But the battles that we had to fight with Marvel corporate to justify having a full orchestra for season one. They did not want us to have an orchestra. Remember? Like
I remember.
They didn't want they didn't want to budget any of that.
I remember.
And when you and Ali said this is the way it needs to be done, you know, Jim Corey, you know, was rough on us. And he made us justify every goddamn violin, every recording session, every orchestration, but we learned from it.
Yes,
it was a pain in the ass, and yes, we wanted the benefit of the doubt, but we also learned a valuable lesson about the game. And the lesson about the game that we learned was budget and timing. And then we flipped it. And then we basically came up with music. And when you guys came up with the music, and I was lucky enough with my team in terms of the writing and directing and the acting, to come up with images that matched the music perfectly. You know, the combination blew them away. And then they began to back off a little bit. And so the thing that we learned as we move forward is that you have to be equally as conversant in both languages.
Yes, and I want to give major props to Don Solaire, obviously, at ABC for helping us with that. And,
no doubt.
And, you know, and our partner, Ali Shaheed, and our brother, Drew Lahero. But in closing, on that note, I want to say something that was a confounding position that we were in.
Oh, shout out because to Michael Brake, to Gabe.
Oh, yeah, Michael Brake. Yeah, all of them.
Gabe Coker and Season Ken as well.
Absolutely, yes. So the confounding position that we're in is that we were making a Marvel character, a character that came out of the blaxploitation era. We were making them relevant now, and we were doing it in our way, in a way where we did not want to conform. And you had to fight to be able to do what it is that you wanted to do, and you had to make certain compromises. But you fought well. And in that, while we're fighting, we're looking at each other and like, wait a minute, Marvel donated money to Trump's campaign? So we're dealing with, wait, what? Our bosses did that? All right, let's make this even more black. And it's like this confounding position that we're in, but we're always in this position. And that's something that we're working on changing.
Yeah. And well, I mean, you constantly have to, you know, use what you got to get what you want. I remember this is kind of an interesting way to close. We were in my office and we were trying to figure out, I don't know if you remember, this is my NAACP award. So it's
yes.
I do it off every once in a while.
Yeah.
Every single vision musically for the theme song that you guys had given them, they rejected.
Yeah.
And part of it was that they were trying to figure out what the credit sequence was going to be and what it was going to be. And then all of a sudden we were up in my office, all three of us. Y'all, you have hair, but Ali and I don't. But we were just basically how do we do this? And I remember looking at this, and I remember saying, wait a minute, what if the camera goes around Luke Cage and his body and his arms, and we were looking at the surface of this, and then at the same time you were trying to think of the different ways to kind of have a musically an image, musically a moment that would either go around fast or slow. And so the fast version was the version that ultimately everybody knows to the world, that Luke Cage theme song. The slow version is the end theme, which we all agree should have been the theme song for Luke Cage.
Absolutely. It's my ringtone on my phone.
I mean, to this day, like I still think that the show would have been even bigger with that theme song. But, you know,
it is what it is, man.
To Kareem Drake's credit, I mean, right, it definitely gives you energy going into every episode.
It does.
But, you know, it's like, that's the thing. It's like, I think what anybody listening to this podcast has to realize is this. As a Black artist, you are always going to have obstacles. If you don't have financial obstacles, there's going to be cultural obstacles, because there are going to be things that you want to express that you can't express. But you cannot let it stop you, because it didn't stop Bob Marley. It didn't stop Spike Lee. It didn't stop my brother, John Singleton. It didn't stop Sarah Vaughan. And it shouldn't stop you. You know what I'm saying? It's like you just got to keep pushing forward always. I keep coming back to that. I know it's a location,
yeah.
but you got to keep moving forward always. And then there's always going to be a moment like that you fight for, and that only faith is going to get you through. Now, we could do an entire podcast about Rakim.
Yeah, we can.
and about that moment, and about
Yes.
waiting and waiting and waiting for him to drop the vocals.
Yeah.
And we got to the last possible minute where everybody was saying, it's a pipe dream. We need a backup plan. You're filming tomorrow. You telling me this is irresponsible. What the hell are you doing?
Yeah, I was. I remember.
And I said, I have faith. We built the field. He will arrive. The song will come.
Yeah.
And it did.
It did. And it was excellent.
You know what I'm saying? And so like,
and hold on. And we went viral on Tiny Desk when we performed that song with Rakim.
Yeah.
Check out the Luke Cage soundtrack if y'all know what we're talking about. But yes, my brother.
Yeah. But that's the thing is that you just gotta, no matter what, you cannot lose faith, because there's going to be every obstacle ahead of you and behind you, and you have to lean on our ancestors and what they've been through.